Welcome, everybody. This is Across the Atlantic. We provide actionable insight at the intersection of geopolitics and capital markets. Today, I'm joined by Ian Williams. Ian is the author and award-winning journalist who has reported from across the world. He covered business and technology for the Sunday Times before moving to television. He was a foreign correspondent first for Channel 4 News in Moscow from 1992 to 1995. And Asia from 1995 to 2006, and then for NBC News from 2006 to 2015, based in Bangkok and Beijing. Ian is the author of Beijing Smog, 0 Days, Every Breath You Take, China's New Tyranny, Fire of the Dragon, China's New Cold War, and Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian has traveled and reported from across China, and he's also covered conflicts in the Balkans, Middle East, and Ukraine. He won Emmy and BAFTA awards for his discovery and reporting on the Serb detention camps during the war in Bosnia. And more recently, he has studied cyber issues at Royal Holloway and at the War Studies Department at King's College London. Ian, thank you so much for being with me this morning. Really appreciate the time, my friend.
A pleasure to join you.
Excellent. Well, Ian, we would just cover the background a little bit, and I always love doing this because, I think I can explain and everybody can look up bios very easily on Google, but there's nothing like hearing the background of the person that we have live and in person. So would be great if you could give us a sense of your background, what drew you to what you're doing now, what drew you to journalism. Would love to hear it.
Curiosity, I guess, Garrett, curiosity about politics, about the world. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent from early on. I mean, it had a certain sort of romantic ring to it, although maybe I didn't appreciate just how tough it was to get your foot in the door. I mean, I started out as a business reporter on the Sunday Times in London, doing the technology beat as well as the older industries as they were at the time. And I got my break when I joined Channel 4 News, made the shift from newspapers to TV, which not many people did back in those days. In fact, my editor accused me of leaving journalism and going into show business. But I made the move to Channel 4 News, which had started a sort of new format, longer form news program. And within a couple of years of joining in 1991, I got my first bureau, which was the Moscow bureau. And for the 3.5 years I was there, I kind of witnessed the chaos that was that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, economic, political, the criminalization of the Russian state in the early 90s, the legacy of which we're still seeing very much now in cyberspace and elsewhere. Before I then moved to Asia, to Hong Kong, to Bangkok, to Beijing, for Channel 4 News, but also for more recently for NBC News. So it's been a lot of fun, and it's satisfied my curiosity, and I've felt that I've really been places at the cutting edge of news where it's been breaking. I've also done work in the Middle East, also in Ukraine and the Balkans, and since I've come back to the UK, I've been doing some studying cyber stuff because I'm just fascinated by all that skullduggery, and also writing books, 2 novels. The first one, Beijing Smog, in which the hero is an internet meme that goes viral, posted by a Chinese blogger and causes all sorts of problems for all sorts of people, but mostly the Chinese Communist Party, which doesn't have a sense of humor. And then the most recent of 3 non-fiction books is Vampire State, which is looking at the nature of the sort of predatory Chinese economy. I've long thought the Chinese economy was an accident waiting to happen. I still do, even though a lot of people are talking it up at the moment and talking up the technology there. I'm not so convinced. And of course, watching closely and with some trepidation the growing relationship between China and Russia.
Excellent. Fantastic. 100%. And look, I think that's an excellent segue into some of the stuff that we're going to talk about, Ian. And look, I think also too, I mean, the curiosity thing, you're a fool if you're not a lifelong learner. That's how you stay fresh. That's how you stay, up relevant and up to date. So excellent. And appreciate the background. So just diving right into it on the China stuff, as well as, the relationship with the Russians, neighbors to the north. So it was 2022 that Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. We're about 4 years, depending on where you want to start it, into Russia's invasion of Ukraine and in the beginning of that war. In having spent a lot of time in a lot of these different places in Moscow, in Asia, how do you view the Sino-Russian relationship? I guess you could start in 2020 or even 2022 at the onset of the war. And then how has it evolved to where we sit today? Obviously, a lot has happened in those intervening years. So from 22 or 2020 to 25, a ton has gone down, a ton has changed. And how has that affected that bilateral relationship?
I think they've grown much closer, but the balance is now considerably in favor of China in terms of the power within that relationship. Russia today is very, very dependent upon China for the prosecution of the war, for sustaining its economy and the political cover. I think if you go back before Russia's full-scale invasion, they were very close, and it was China was the more powerful partner. It had the more powerful economy. It was the growing country. Russia was much more stagnant. And I think that the Ukraine war has really pushed things in China's direction. I believe that Russia wouldn't be able to prosecute the war in Ukraine without it being underwritten by China. By that, I mean not only China buying Russian raw materials, whether it's gas or oil or other minerals, to prop the economy up, the sale of dual use technology, whether that's chips or machine tools, or the political cover that China gives to Russia by reiterating its justifications for the war. And I think it suits China as well to have Europe, but also to have the United States tied up in Europe, focused on Europe, because it draws attention away from the Pacific and particularly away from Taiwan. So I think China is effectively bankrolling that war indirectly. China calls the relationship a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for the new era. I mean, what a mouthful, but they don't do alliances. See, China doesn't have any allies in the sense that the United States does, or Britain does, or other members of NATO. They call them partnerships, and there's a hierarchy of partnerships. And there've been, academic studies written about all this bizarre language that China sometimes uses to describe all these different partnerships. But Russia is the closest partner and the closest they would get to an alliance. Now, you ask, why aren't they described as allies? Well, China's always been very reluctant to have conventional allies because it implies a greater sense of obligation than they are prepared to commit to. And also, I think there's a historic thing here. China, Zhonghua, has always regarded itself as the center of the world. And there's a very Chinese-centric view of the world. And an alliance implies a certain amount of equality, a certain amount of commitment to your allies, whereas I think China's always wanted to interact and engage with the world on its terms, and alliances don't really fit into that understanding of the world. But when you look at the way that relationship has developed, they have become much closer. Russia's become much, much more dependent on China economically, politically. I don't think that always goes down well with some Russian nationalists, and there are signs of some unease in Russia about the relationship. There are deep historic animosities. There are suspicions which come to the surface from time to time. It's not a particularly stable relationship, but I think they're drawn together by what I would call raw self-interest. They have a common adversary in the United States and Western democracies more broadly, and their interests at the moment quite closely align. Whether or not that can be sustained over the longer term, it's harder to say. I mean, one of the things I'm always fascinated about is the history, because the Chinese Communist Party bangs on a lot about unequal treaties, 100 years of humiliation. They present themselves as a redeeming power after all this humiliation at the hands of rapacious foreigners. Now, if you look at the history, the most rapacious of those foreigners in terms of land grabbed from China was Russia. In the 18th century, under several different treaties, Russia took about 1.5 million square kilometers of China. That's bigger than Italy, France, and the UK combined. That includes the Far East. It includes the Russian city of Vladivostok, which the Chinese called Hai-Shen-Wai. Now and again, Chinese historians, last year, I think it was, book publishers were told that all maps in Chinese books were to show the Chinese names of these former areas. Now, it's testament to the way that the relationship has changed, that this didn't raise any hackles in Russia. In the past, there would have been people, especially in the Far East, standing up and getting very angry about that.
So hand-wringing, yeah.
Yeah, but so there are deep-seated suspicions there. China, Russia's been trying to get China to commit to another gas pipeline going across Mongolia, an important investment as far as Russia's concerned, because it can then send the gas it can't send any longer to Europe. China's been dragging its feet on that. At the recent summit in Beijing, the head of Gazprom, Russia's big gas organization, massive company, announced there had been a memorandum of understanding on this. The Chinese said nothing.
All right.
And the reason they didn't, I think, is because there are still things to work out. They haven't agreed on price. They haven't agreed on who'll pay for it. And China has the whip hand. So there are all these instabilities and potential points of tension in the relationship, though I think at the moment it suits them both to have this partnership as they describe it. And I think also Xi and Putin see the world in the same way. It's very much a nationalist vision. Putin has what he calls his Ruski Mir, his Russian world, the unity of Russian-speaking countries as he sees them, and a lot of countries which are independent he sees as being rightfully part of Russian-speaking land. Xi has his China dream, which is not a lot different. It's about rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, starting by grabbing Taiwan. Both are sort of imperialist visions, but because of the history, because of all that land that was grabbed by Russia, those imperialist visions do have inbuilt conflict, because a lot of Chinese nationalists regard the rightful borders of China as being the Qing dynasty borders. And of course, which includes a large chunk of what is modern day Russia. So a close relationship, a dependent one as far as Russia's concerned, highly dependent on China, but one which is sort of riven with instabilities.
100%. Yeah, no, thank you for that. And God, I should get out a paper and pen as we go, because there's a few points I want to draw you out on, in a good way, of course, Ian. But, so just to start with a few of the items, right? So that deep mistrust, and that this is something, and we'll get into this as well. But before we do, it's just like, what is like the general Westerner's opinion or idea of the relationship, the bilateral relationship between China and Russia? I think for most people, I mean, you go into Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal or any, of these news outlets, which like a lot of investors use or companies use, or et cetera. I mean, you're going to find a lot of the language, at least that I see and read. It's just, you see no limits friendship, you see just unbreakable, not alliance, as you're saying, but unbreakable bond, all this kind of language, which would insinuate they have these like unbreakable binds and ties. But that, with a lot of the things that you're saying, is just not true. But a lot of folks don't realize that and understand that there's a lot of historical reasons and a lot of history behind that relationship. A lot of it centered around the East and Siberia, right? There's a lot of land out there that has jostled back and forth between each nation. But to bring it more to modern days, and I'm struck with some of the things you're saying in a good way again, but they really stand out to me, right? So at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, the two countries seemed much more at parity with one another. Meaning, they were on par with each other economically, at least, on paper. They were on par with each other, maybe more militarily. I mean, the Russian military, I think most people's opinion and perception of it was vastly different from 2022 to now. So there's much more parity in the relationship there. I mean, now you fast forward to 2025, it seems like you said, I mean, China in many ways holds the whip hand. And Russia's debasing itself in a lot of ways just to keep China on side, right? You mentioned the Gazprom deal. That's just one of many that I think Russia's willing to, take a hit on just to see through, because they need China to continue to buy their energy. They need to continue to get the dual use technology from them. They need Chinese banks, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. So it's been really interesting to see that debasement of Russia just to keep this dream of, hey, we need to, overturn the Western-led global order alive, Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right. And I think if you look at the beginning of the conflict, when they announced their No Limits partnership, it was at a summit in Beijing just before the Winter Olympics in 2022. And then, of course, 30 days later, the invasion of Ukraine happened. Even as they were speaking, there were 100,000 troops on the borders. And there's been some speculation about, well, did Xi know? Was he tipped off? Did it come as a surprise? And I think I find it inconceivable that at least he wasn't given a sense of what was about to happen. But I think there was a belief in China that it would be over with quickly, that Putin managed to convince them that this special military operation would be just that. It would be over in a matter of days, if not hours, with the toppling of the regime in Kiev, swift journey down the road from Belarus. And I think China was genuinely taken back by the incompetence of the Russian armed forces, taken back in itself, but also because the Chinese armed forces are in many ways modeled on those of Russia, use a lot of the same equipment. Even the stuff that's made in China, a lot of that is copies of stuff that they acquired from Russia. And so I think China had to quickly adjust to the fact that their erstwhile partner was bogged down in a war and was prosecuting that war in an extremely haphazard and incompetent manner. And that came as a bit of a shock in China. But I think, and early on, there seemed to be some confusion about how, in what way and in what manner should they support Russia? Because China bangs on a lot about self-determination, about sovereignty, about the importance of borders, all of which, of course, have been violated by its Russian partner, and had to sort of adjust the message somewhat. But yeah, I think over the years that have followed, Russia has become highly, highly dependent on China, and China has emerged as the partner with the whip hand, with Russia really being unable to do. I mean, you speak to Russians and they'll tell you, yes, China is overwhelmingly the stronger power economically, but we are still militarily stronger. And this, we're having all this experience which China wants to learn from to improve its own military, to improve its own strategy, possibly vis-a-vis Taiwan. But certainly compared with where we started at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, China has emerged as overwhelmingly the stronger of the partners.
Yeah, and to linger on this idea a little bit longer before we move on, Ian, I mean, it's interesting to me as well, because they clearly both share via their own actions and statements. I mean, you really don't have to read between the lines about the larger end goal, which is the overturning of the Western-led global rules-based order. Again, a mouthful. So that's, for both of them, that seems to be the end goal. But how they see themselves, I don't know. I mean, there just seems to be some incongruence to where they both see themselves in the future and how they see themselves as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese economy, I think, is roughly the size of Italy's, and rather the Russian economy. Yeah. And the Chinese economy is enormous. And I think that when they look at the international order, their view of it, that there's a bit of a tendency sometimes to think, yes, they are unified in their desire to see a different international order, but there's a different emphasis. Russia's really been the disruptor. Russia's has never missed an opportunity, whether it's through cyber disruption, cyber sabotage, all sorts of other operations, to try and undermine a system it feels is hostile to it and in which it doesn't really have any great stake. Now, we've got to remember that China's rise has depended upon that system. China is part of, it's much more closely integrated into the international economic system, and to see that system simply overturned would be very damaging to China. So its approach is more subtle. Yes, it wants a new international system. Yes, it wants a multipolar world, or whatever the latest sort of jargon is coming from the CCP. But it sees itself as replacing the old order. It spends a lot of time trying to shape standards in international organizations, in trying to put its people in places in the UN or elsewhere. It's very much less focused on simply undermining the system, as we see with Russia, and more focused on working to replace it, to get their own people in place, to introduce sort of the Chinese techno ecosystem, for instance, Chinese technology, all the services and standards that surround it, is increasingly powerful, and Russia simply doesn't have that.
Right.
So China has a system in place which it would like to think of as replacing the world order that it so dislikes, even though that old world order has benefited enormously. So it's a bit more complex, and it's a little clever, if you like, than the Russian approach, which is one simply of disruption and undermining a system. Russia, if you look at cyberspace, which is something I study quite closely, the difference there between Russia, which has always been the disruptor, the vandal, whereas China traditionally was focused on cyber espionage. It wanted to grab what it could to modernize its economy, modernize its armed forces. It's borrowing a lot more now from Russia, and it's becoming a bit of a disruptor itself. Recent activities in US infrastructure and elsewhere, Volt Typhoon as it's been called. But certainly, if you look at the way China has grown by exploiting the system and working within it, bending and exploiting the rules to its advantage, and Russia, which has been more of the disruptive outsider, the vandal, it's actually quite a different approach. And then you do ask, well, yes, so they're unified in wanting to move on from the old world order, but it's very difficult to see any kind of agreement about what they would replace it with, other than something which is a little bit friendlier to themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And, I don't know. I mean, to me, that's just like the most interesting piece, because we can kind of vaguely, I mean, it probably depends on who you ask, but from my perspective, you can kind of vaguely see what like the contours of the end of the Russian war against Ukraine might look like. But then from there, everybody nervously looks to 2027 to 2028. Is China actually going to try to invade Taiwan? I mean, in the global, the post World War II global order that was established by the U.S. and again other democracies, I mean, is facing what feels like watershed moments. Okay, we're gonna pass on from the Russia-Ukraine war. Now the next big conflict is the China, a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan. It's just crazy to me to see, like, what's the next, what happens after all of this? I mean, play this out like 10 years after 2028, 20 years after 2028. What does global governance even look like? And so to try to game out, as we're doing right now, each vision for what that future might look like. I mean, you kind of see some stark differences right off the bat, which is kind of funny. So anyway, interesting nonetheless. But moving on, Ian, so bringing us back to just that bilateral relationship, and a lot of this we're already kind of touching on and talking about. But if you had to like choose, like, what are like the most misunderstood aspects of China and Russia's relationship that most people, where you and I sit in the UK and the US, and just think about the West more broadly, but what are like the biggest things that people get wrong or misunderstand?
I think one of the things that I sometimes think needs correcting a bit is we see all these military exercises that Russia and China now take part in. They call them joint military exercises. They've certainly grown enormously in terms of the component parts, in terms of the geographic reach, getting into areas close to Alaska, which gave a shock to Washington. the Arctic, near Taiwan and Japan, in the Middle East. They've grown rapidly in terms of their content, the numbers involved, and in terms of the geographic reach. But one of the things I find fascinating is there's this whole notion of interoperability, which a lot of military types talk about. It's what NATO does. It's what the US and Japan, the US and South Korea, it's what the Western allies do. And it implies that the operation is a joint operation. Whereas with the Russians and the Chinese, there is no interoperability, or very limited interoperability. You know, they turn up, they maybe exchange a few staff, and then they go and perform. But there's no meaningful interoperability, because that takes an enormous amount of trust, especially when you're talking about information systems, cyber systems, data, digital systems. And military analysts will tell you that warfighting now is about the ability to bring together all the different component parts, whether it's space, navy, air force, cyber, and unify them in a way that is effective on the battlefield. And this requires very sophisticated systems, which Western democracies, NATO, are themselves sort of struggling to fully implement this interoperability. And Russia and China really don't come close to that. And I think that the notion that they could fight a war together, which is sometimes implied when people look at these military exercises, is wrong, because I think they just get in each other's way, because there isn't that, they don't come close to NATO or even the Pacific allies in terms of the interoperability of their forces. And I think, again, that the basis of that is a trust issue. And I think the other thing that I think we sometimes get wrong is the extent to which this is really a relationship that's built on raw self-interest and a common adversary. And when you do drill down, it's for all the words you see coming out about every time they meet: best friend, close friend, dear friend, and multiple variations on that, limitless friendship. But when you look at it more closely, it's not really borne out by what happens in practice. And I think there's still a big leap from what we see at the moment with the relations between China and Russia, and something which is militarily viable to either fight together or is economically equal.
100%. Yeah, on interoperability, I mean, I think a microcosm of that as well. I mean, you saw this when North Korean soldiers were fighting in Russia. And I think, I'm going to get this wrong, but one side was shooting at the other side, thinking that they were the enemy, aka Ukrainians. So either the Russians were accidentally shooting at the North Korean soldiers, or the North Korean soldiers were accidentally shooting at the Russian soldiers. And so there was like this massive miscommunication, and they each thought the other was the Ukrainian side. And that's just, again, a microcosm of what you're talking about now. Extrapolate that out to warships in the Indo-Pacific and fighter jets, and it's just like, I mean, if you don't speak a common language, it's going to be tough, right? And even just interoperability of systems, not even just the language.
Yeah, and in fact, an old intelligence hand I was talking to recently was telling me that he'd been told that some of these exercises that were taking place at brigade commander level, they were using Google Translate. You know, and that's
yeah.
And he looked at me and he said that's no way to fight a war.
Yeah, I would assume so, right, man? Yeah.
And you probably saw as well, Garrett, that recent I think it was a few weeks ago that this document turned up in the New York Times, which purported to come from the FSB, which is Russian intelligence, the successor of the KGB. And it was an internal document which talked about how much spying China was doing on Russia, and talked about how they were trying to get all this information about the performance of kit in the field in Ukraine. Now, the fact they're not being given that is interesting in itself, but nevertheless, there were all these accusations about spying from China, from the Arctic through to industrial, through to military firms, through to Ukraine. And the New York Times bounced it off about, I think, about half a dozen different intelligence agencies, and were told that in their opinion, they thought it was a genuine document. And then it raises all sorts of issues about why someone at the FSB would want to leak that paper, to that document, to a Western organization, and implies that there is a lot of Chinese espionage going on in Russia, which is not surprising in some senses. Everybody spies on everybody else. But what was interesting to me was the areas they were looking at, suggesting that if they were that close allies, then they wouldn't have to spy to get that material.
Right. Yeah, I think the piece on that too is interesting, right? And it goes to your broader point of, yes, everybody spies on everybody, but to have that kind of like level of mistrust and dragging feet on other projects as well. Again, I always come back to that gas pipeline out in Siberia, crossing Mongolia. Another example of what you're talking about. One of Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal, et cetera. Take your pick of publication. But especially out here in the West, they use language and this could just be a translation issue, but they use language like, no limits friendship, and, we are we're brothers, in arms, and all this kind of stuff. This isn't language that I think most Western leaders use. And so whenever, audiences out in the West see it, it just paints a complete misconception of how close the two actually are. And then the items that you're talking about, so surveillance and spying on, to get the kid, and how effective it's been in Ukraine, is an example of that mistrust. And anyway, it always drives me crazy. I'm just like, this is not accurate. This is not true.
Yeah, and in fact, you could argue that the more you need to keep calling someone your best friend, good friend, dear friend, it sort of implies that you're not perhaps as confident as you could be. One area where they have cooperated quite closely is on misinformation, where they've signed a number of formal deals to exchange each other's news, for want of a better description, and to distribute it through their different outlets, because they complement each other. Places in the world that Russia's strongest, China doesn't quite penetrate as well, and vice versa. So they have deals where they magnify and distribute each other's propaganda through official state channels. And of course, that's before you get to the unofficial stuff, the networks of fake accounts and bots, which both Russia and China employ in vast amounts through Western social media. Of course, Western social media is not available in China or Russia, so they use these systems which are open and can be manipulated for their own purposes. And that side of the cooperation has been quite close, but arguably it's much easier to cooperate on something like that than it is, say, on more sort of harder edged cyber weapons or strategic cooperation.
Ian, you're starting to touch on a favorite topic of mine. I think we could go to TikTok, but we'll save that conversation for another time. I have so many thoughts on that. I've been ringing a bell and alarms on that for the longest time.
Rightly.
Another friend of mine, we were talking about before, Mike Studman. He's also a pretty vocal advocate of this anyway. So we'll have to set up another time to talk about a whole host of other issues, but moving on, keeping us moving here, Ian. So, you spent a lot of time out in Asia, Beijing as well. And this is kind of a more nuanced question, drills down a little bit. So we're talking a lot about the macro, but to take a smaller view, I guess. What from your experience and perception and everything else, what's your sense of the Chinese people's view of their current leadership in Xi Jinping? Right, he's been president in heavy quotations for a long time now. Is it your sense there's any desire for change? Every so often you'll see these little protests come up, but it seems pretty non-important, pretty non-material. What's your read of it? What's your sense? Would be interested to hear, because I think pretty much nobody in the U.S., at least a lot of folks in my cohort, my age, there's no information on this. It'd be helpful.
It's a tough one, because you're never going to get honest opinion surveys in China. Some people claim to go there and talk to people about but you're not going to give an honest answer when someone says, what do you think of the Communist Party? Because the potential cost of saying not much are pretty high. And as you see, every now and again there are protests. There were the white paper protests, the A4 protests during COVID, which shook the Chinese government and probably led to them abandoning their crazy zero COVID campaign when all those protesters took to the street. Then there was that wonderful protest in Chongqing recently, where the guy was projecting criticism of the Communist Party onto the side of a building in Chongqing. And then when police raided his apartment, he'd already left, but he'd set up secret cameras in the apartment, which then filmed the police going through all his stuff. And all this was live streamed.
Oh, really?
So,
okay, I didn't know
it's worth looking it up. So he turned the surveillance state on itself. And it was a brilliant show of defiance. He then promptly left the country. And I think he'd only activated all that remotely. But it was a wonderful example of using the technology of the surveillance state against the surveillance state. But how strong is Xi Jinping? It's an interesting question, because I remember going to interview Ai Weiwei, the Chinese dissident artist in exile in Portugal now, and I asked him, what do you think? How powerful is this man? And he said to me, well, history will tell you that when the emperor appears to be at his strongest, he's frequently at his most vulnerable. And then you see the purges that have taken place recently in the military, huge swathes of top military leadership being cleared out, including the rocket force, the most elite part of the PLA, responsible for the nuclear forces, losing defense minister, foreign minister. This doesn't imply a very stable environment around Xi, although others would argue it suggests that he's actually quite strong, because he can just turf these people out at will. To me, I think there is the biggest, the most challenging thing that we could find, or he could find, is there's been almost this unwritten pact that here's the Communist Party, we bring you stability, we bring you into economic advancement, and you just keep quiet when it comes to politics. A lot of people call that the unspoken deal with the Chinese people. And, certainly some of his biggest supporters have been among the middle class, because they've done quite well out of recent years. But I think that the Chinese economy has real issues at the moment. I don't see renewable energy, or whatever it is that I don't see a technologically driven economy emerging. Innovation driven, because I question whether the Communist Party is able to preside over a genuine innovation economy. You've still got huge problems with the property sector, unemployment, youth unemployment particularly. There are big issues there. And I think that if the Communist Party can't deliver on the economy, and I think it is reaching an inflection point. The old models don't work anymore. It's got to the point where they have to dream up something else. Then that brings into question the whole issue of political stability, in the sense that if you can't deliver on the economy, if you can't deliver on stability, and Xi Jinping has emphasized security and control over the economy, then what does that mean? Where does that get you? Where's the discontent? And I think that we could see some interesting times in China ahead. I wouldn't stick my neck out and give you a date when he may no longer be there, but I do think that these could be challenging times for the Communist Party, because I think that the economic model, which has delivered growth, heady levels of growth over recent years, simply isn't sustainable anymore. And I don't think that they have anything coherent to replace it with, because to genuinely reform the economy would challenge the power of the party, and he's not prepared to do that.
Right. Yeah, and I think I saw some stat recently, or even just like a while ago, most, you take your average Chinese citizen, they're not making money in any Chinese stock market. It's mostly through property ownership. Again, ownership, heavy asterisks on that one, because it's just 100-year lease or something from the Chinese government. So if you can't make money or improve your just overall net worth or lifestyle or wealth or whatever you have, whatever benchmark of success you want to apply to yourself. You can't find that through investing in the stock market, the Chinese stock market. You can barely, if not get that, as we saw through the housing crisis that they had recently. You can't get it through housing, investing in housing. Where do you get it? And to your point, the social contract of, we provide economic stability and growth while, we're going to be heavy-handed on your political lives. If you can't provide that, then yeah, I mean, the natural, and this is true of any society really, it's just probably most relevant right now in China. But, if you can't provide the social contract, then you're probably going to see some unrest in some form or fashion. Right. And I think it's really interesting, too. So that era of common prosperity, I think, thinking back for a few years, remember when Jack Ma got disappeared for criticizing the Chinese banking regulator? Right. And it was that. And then you heard common prosperity coming from Xi and all the party officials, essentially, reforming some industries, essentially just saying, we don't really want entrepreneurship. So it goes back to your point of, can they even preside over an innovation economy? I am of the same opinion as you, Ian. I say no, but I mean, you talk to some podcasts and other folks I listen to, investors out there in the US, the way that they talk about it, it's like, oh, it's great, it's whatever. To me, it just seems like you're investing in a direct adversary that we're going to have to contend with in a few years. Hopefully not kinetically, but we're definitely economically for a long time. So why are we funding our biggest geopolitical adversary? Treaded into a bit of different ground. I know we're talking about the Chinese, the Chinese people's perception of their leadership. So it's interesting. And are you familiar at all with the geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan at all? He's out here in the West. Have you heard that name?
I have, yeah. But remind me of his recent.
Well, he's just really he's fiery when he comes to, you mentioned, hey, I'm not going to give you a single date when Xi Jinping may no longer be in power. Well, he's not afraid to give opinions on that. So anyway, I just thought I'd bring it up. He's kind of a funny guy. He makes a lot of good calls though. So I guess, moving on to a next piece, Ian, and again, I'm just looking at the clock, so I want to make sure we hit on everything here and be respectful of your time, of course. We talked a lot about the Chinese-Russian no limits friendship. I think we're pretty well suited there, to be able to answer the question, is this truly a no limits friendship? No is the answer, right? And we just laid out all the myriad of reasons why that's not the case. So I want to move on to another piece, and I ask every single person that I have on this question because I just love getting all these different experts across different fields, their opinions on it, because this seems to be a seminal moment coming up in a handful of years, call it 3 to 5 years. What, Ian, do you think the actual risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is? A lot of people in U.S. circles and elsewhere almost think of it as a foregone conclusion. But would just love to get your thoughts and opinions.
I think an invasion would probably be the last resort from Xi. The reason I say that is because he's set so much of his own authority on taking Taiwan that to try and to fail would be the end of him and possibly the end of the Communist Party, because it's become so central to his mission of the Chinese dream. I think an invasion of Taiwan would be extraordinarily difficult in terms of the sheer numbers of troops, of equipment, of kit you would need to do that. There are only certain times of the year when the Taiwan Straits lend themselves to the right conditions are there to cross. There are only so many beaches in Taiwan and only on the west coast, which conceivably could be landed on. When I was last there, it was earlier this summer, talking to military analysts in Taipei, and they liken the Taiwan Strait to that road down from Belarus to Kiev that the Russian forces were defeated on. But that said, I think that in many ways you already have a form of invasion going on. There's a grey war going on being prosecuted against Taiwan, and that has many elements to it. You have cyber, you have disinformation, you have sabotage. 37 times digital internet cables have been cut to Taiwan or its islands, which it controls closer to China. Of course, we had a touch of this in the Baltic Sea as well, with Chinese ships implicated in cutting communications cables. But it's been happening routinely around Taiwan, and so they're already facing multiple intimidation, military exercises of an intensity that we've never seen before, combined with cyber disinformation and all these other multiple. They call it the anaconda strategy. You slowly squeeze the island so that you create they lose their will to fight, and that is a strategy in the short term. Certainly don't wouldn't say that an invasion won't happen, but I think that they would want to try and push these other efforts first before they resorted to that, because I think it wouldn't be easy. And I think that the costs associated would be high. I mean, it's interesting, when Nancy Pelosi came to Taiwan,
Right.
2 or 3 years ago, and there were various, there was a huge cyber onslaught. And one of the things that I hadn't realized until I was there recently is that they attacked the screens, Chinese hackers attacked the screens of 7-Eleven stores, convenience stores. Now, that might not sound much in the bigger scheme of cyber attacks, but there's a 7-Eleven on every corner in Taiwan. And what they did was take over the screens and start broadcasting propaganda through those screens. And this really shook up the cybersecurity people in Taiwan, because they realized that there were probably implants that had already been placed in those systems, which were activated at that time. Now, they're puzzled, because why would you throw away a zero-day exploit, which is one of the best tools in the cyber armory? But they day to day, day by day, Taiwan is being attacked in multiple ways, which fall short of a full-scale invasion, but add up to something which is potentially much more threatening for them. And I think sometimes we fixate too much on what will the date of the invasion be, when we should be concentrating on the multiple ways in which, multiple gray areas in which China is already attacking Taiwan and trying to undermine their confidence, undermine their ability to fight, undermine their systems. And of course, that's before you get to the chip plants and the high-tech industries in Taiwan, which have been targeted multiple times with cyber attacks. But it is interesting. I think my last night there, I was at dinner with some Taiwanese friends, and they told me this joke whereby a number of Taiwanese get together and they ask where should we hide in the event of a Chinese invasion. And one of them says, well, let's head down the subway. Another says, well, let's head to the hills. And the third says, no, let's go to a chip plant. The idea being that would be the safest place in the event of an attack. I mean, I'm not convinced necessarily it would be. But that's the other thing, that the sheer cost. I think it was Bloomberg came up with some astronomical figure for the hit on the world economy, because Taiwan is so central, a high-tech cog in the world economy, that the hit, and this would be to China equally as to anybody else. So I wouldn't discount the danger by any means of an invasion, because it's so central to Xi's vision for China, and so much of the military buildup we've seen in recent years. There's rarely been a military buildup or modernization in peacetime as big as what we've seen in China. Ferries these days routinely have to be able to take armored vehicles, even if they're being built for local routes. It's all being geared towards invading Taiwan and keeping America out of the fight by developing missiles, for instance, the carrier killer missiles, as they're called, similar sort of arsenal to try and prevent the US from coming to the assistance of Taiwan. So, a huge focus of China's military modernization has been in getting the kit and the ability to take Taiwan by force. But that said, I still believe that Xi would see that as a last resort. And if he can find a way of squeezing Taiwan into submission by these multiple grey ways, that's what he'd prefer. Although, my experience from visiting there is, even though it's politically very, very vibrant, and there's lots of different opinions within Taiwan about engagement with China, there's no way that anybody wants to become part of China, certainly while the Communist Party is still in charge.
100%, 100%. Yeah, I think the gray aspects of that are some of the most interesting, Ian. So, you talk about gray warfare and cutting undersea fiber optic cables that, have enable connectivity via internet globally, Baltic Sea, etc., but mostly around Taiwan recently. And I think, on the hard stuff outside of the gray warfare, I think the number of times, and I saw a chart on this recently, the number of times that Chinese warplanes, fighter jets, have buzzed Taiwanese airspace has just gone dramatically up, and they can barely even respond because, as you might imagine, there's just a larger population in the Chinese mainland, more jets, and not enough fuel, even for the Taiwanese sometimes to respond to all the incursions into their airspace. But then the gray warfare stuff, I think, is, equally, if not more important, because, if you cut off all communication to the island, to the country, you're in some deep trouble, right? And it's not just communication, it's banking information, it's all sorts of stuff, right? So that I think is super helpful. And two, it also goes back to what we were talking about before of how China views itself and how Russia views itself. China viewing itself as an ushering in and leader of this alternate world order. Well, if they go full kinetic conflict like Russia's gone, you're going to burn all of your diplomatic bridges. People no longer see you as a responsible actor, right? And so, you're kind of putting all your chips on the table if you go for a kinetic conflict or kinetic takeover, invasion, war, however you want to put it, of Taiwan. That makes a lot of sense.
China talks a lot about, the peaceful rise and all.
Sure.
When you look at it closely, it doesn't really bear scrutiny. There's
right.
But nevertheless, there's this self-perception, which especially when it's trying to sell itself to the global south, the sort of less developed countries. But you're right. The cables are the digital lifelines of the modern economy. Some of the military exercises recently have been specifically practicing an embargo of the island, right. which is again one of the key things with a grey zone warfare is, where's the line? Where do you cross the line from grey to full-on kinetic warfare? And China's been very good. We've seen it in the South China Sea with the intimidation of the Filipinos around disputed islands. Pushing the line, pushing it close, but where do you cross the line, and who says you've crossed the line? And that's one of the things about hybrid warfare, grey zone warfare, is the ability and the willingness to push things just so far, and multiple things which together add up to quite a significant assault. But each of them individually, does that cross somebody's line, or doesn't it cross somebody's line? And it's fascinating stuff. And where we read a lot about Ukraine being very much almost a laboratory for all these new military techniques and weaponry, and incredible what the Ukrainians have done in terms of resourcefulness in the way they fight and the tools they're using. But in terms of grey warfare, Taiwan itself has become a laboratory, both in trying to defend against stuff like disinformation and intimidation, and China trying all these new techniques. And of course, China watching very carefully, as you say, the prosecution of the war by Russia in Ukraine, trying to learn lessons from that. Taiwan also trying to learn lessons in terms of, asking themselves, do we need all these shiny, very expensive planes and ships and submarines, or should we be investing this money more effectively in smaller, more deadly, more affordable kit, whether that be drones, whether that be highly maneuverable missile launchers, the sort of stuff which has worked extraordinarily well for Ukraine against what on paper was a far more superior army.
On paper, that's the key point, right?
Yeah.
I love Well, and so I'm looking at the clock here, and again, being respectful of your time. I do have one more. This was on the docket for talking about gray warfare tactics, hybrid warfare tactics. And my mind is immediately going to, and we're talking about, Ukraine and the entire war is a testing ground for tactics, kits, etc. My mind immediately goes to some more recent events, and I'd be really curious to get your thoughts on this because, it seems like Russia has crossed that Rubicon, that threshold of what is gray and what's not. And I think you probably already know where I'm going to go with this, but what do you think about, Russia, excuse me, not China, Russia, first flying drones into Polish airspace, and then not 2 days later, flying an actual jet for 12 minutes in Estonian airspace. Then subsequently, we had the UN General Assembly not too long ago. See a whole bunch of excoriation, what happened from Western leaders. And then subsequently on top of that, NATO introduces Eastern Century, which frankly, I don't really know what it entails, but it's a response clearly to what the gray warfare tactics that Russia's employing. And it seems to have actually, you kick the hornet's nest enough and the hornets are going to come out. So it seems like we're at that point. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. I mean, it's ironic that here we are, we've got Russia learning from China, China's tactics around Taiwan. Whether it's the drones, the fighters, we've seen sabotage attempts against military manufacturers and other in Europe, which have been blamed on Russia. And I think hybrid warfare, grey zone warfare is so much more difficult to counteract because where is the line? Where do you say enough is enough? And when you do, how do you hit back? And I think Russia is testing NATO. It's testing the individual responses of countries on the front line, the responses of allies, and the responses of the US. And it's looking carefully at what comes out of this. And I think it will probably take a very robust response, possibly the shooting down of a Russian jet, which strays into NATO airspace, in order to put the marker down that enough is enough. And Russia certainly seems intent on pushing with the aim of trying to see where the line is and where NATO is prepared to draw that line. And I think we're getting close to that point where somebody's going to have to draw that line pretty firmly and respond to incursions across it.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And again, I don't think anybody really has a good answer to this where we stand right now, because again, okay, we introduced Eastern Century. Great. What does that mean? You have individual countries, Estonia and Poland, saying, hey, we will shoot down whatever aircraft, whether that be drone or jet, entering our airspace next time. While at the same time, you have Marco Rubio and U.S. leaders saying, well, we maybe not shoot down. So, we're clearly nobody's on the same page as of yet, but it seems to be our responses seem to be evolving.
Yeah, I mean, in Denmark, when I think that they would have been quite willing to shoot down the drones, but rightly took the view that if you're going to launch a $1 million missile at a $20,000 drone, and it's an expensive way of bringing down a drone, and you risk causing all sorts of collateral damage to potentially built up areas below. But no, I mean, in the same way that I think when the Taiwanese fly jets across the median line towards Taiwan, they're looking to gauge the reaction time. They're looking to pick up signals, intelligence, and they're looking to see how the system in Taiwan responds. And I think we're seeing a similar version of that with Russia. They're looking to see not only how the system technically responds, but how it responds politically. They're logging what comes out of Tallinn, Vilnius, the Baltic states, what comes out of Poland, how that compares with what's coming out of London or Paris. How does that compare with what's coming out of Washington? So in the same way that signals intelligence might look at the various digital data that's provoked by an incursion, so the Russians are looking at the political data to see what it tells them about the resolve of NATO, about the US willingness to support European allies, about some European allies' willingness to support other allies. So, yeah, this will all be logged and it'll all be analyzed. And, I think there are multiple reasons behind this. And as you say, it's going to take somebody to draw a firm line and take action when that line is crossed before perhaps it stops.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. Well, honestly, Ian, we could keep going, but I see I've taken enough of your time this afternoon for you, but I really appreciate it. So let's wrap, Ian. Where can folks find you? Ian, what are you working on? And what is new with Ian Williams?
Through my website, ianwilliamsauthor.net will have most of the up-to-date stuff, the articles that I'm writing, the latest books, where to get them. I'm actually finishing writing up a PhD at the moment, which I've had on the go for a while between doing the other stuff. And it's an interesting one because it's about the cyber relationship between Russia and China. Cyber skullduggery, it's one of my pet subjects, and for a long time I've been fascinated by the way that China and Russia, which started out in quite different places in terms of the way they use their cyber power, have progressively come together and converged, and now are looking increasingly similar in that China is engaged in more disruptive cyber operations. Volt Typhoon against US infrastructure is one example of that. Russia also embracing some Chinese techniques in the way they're trying to build their own great firewall of internet censorship in Russia. So it's really looking at the way these two cyber powers are converging in the way they use their tools and their abilities and their strategies. So I'm just finished writing that up actually at the moment, and I'm hoping there might be a book out of that one as well. But it's fascinating stuff. But as always, when you're looking at these subjects, there's so much going on, and every time I write another chapter, things will happen, and I think, that feels a bit out of date, and you're there forever updating because we live in dynamic geopolitical times, and when you're a student or a writer dealing with that, it's sometimes you have to run pretty fast to keep abreast of it.
That's right. Well, Ian, I can't thank you enough again for the time. This has been incredible. Thank you again. I know we're on a bit of a big time difference here, UK versus Texas and US. So thank you. I'm going to link everything below. So your website, books, everything, please, everybody go check them out. They're fantastic. Ian, thank you again, sir. Really appreciate it.
A pleasure to join you.